back to the title. So it's called The Task of the Dancer. And what I noticed after reading the 15-page article is that he hadn't indicated that he talked to a single dancer about their experience. So the dancer's voice is completely absent from this conversation, which is a pretty bold move from a scholarly perspective to write an article titled The Task of the Dancer and effectively speak for an entire population without thinking to talk to a member of it. But unfortunately, this is not a new phenomenon, and dancers are notoriously, as a population, repeatedly spoken for and spoken about. And the trope of the mute dancer is nothing new, and it's not abstract. It just seems particularly grievous when the topic at hand is freedom. So my aim for the summer research was to help remedy that situation. I wanted to talk to dancers about how they experience freedom in their professional work. So I sent out a survey and collected 57 responses from professional dancers, some of whom are in the room with us today. And I also conducted more in-depth personal interviews with 5 professional dancers. And I chose to focus on the demographic that Lepecki focused on, modern experimental dancers, which also is the domain of my own professional experience. So Lepecki in his article refers to 3 choreographers who he really thinks are demonstrating choreopolitics well. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about one. Her name's Sarah Mitchelson, and I actually worked for her briefly in New York. But the piece that Lepecki refers to specifically is called Devotion, Study Number 1, and she created it for the Whitney Biennial in 2012. So it's called Devotion. Here's the set. And the piece features this woman, Nicole Manarino, sustaining this position for 67 minutes while running and hopping backwards in patterns along the floor of the Whitney gallery space. Lepecki even shares in his article that this position is one of the infamous stress positions used by dictatorial regimes to inflict pain on political prisoners. So, how does he link that to freedom? So the title of the piece gives him a way in, Devotion. And he makes the point that freedom isn't easy, and it's in the dancer's tireless commitment to what seems like an impossible task that she makes the choice to go against the grain again and again and again. And he says this is an example of a choreopolitical affirmation. So devotion is a practice of freedom. So for me, that begs the question, devotion to what or to whom? So this is what he says, and just kind of wordy, but just stick with me. What devotion does alongside its performance is to relocate the imperative as no longer being an order coming from above, a command the dancer must blindly obey and follow, apolitically. Instead, it requires planning, preparation, technique, a collective and affective devotion, as long as it's devotion not to the author of the plan, but an impersonal devotion to the plan itself. So I wanted to just highlight for a moment this no longer being an order coming from above bit. Yeah, and then just return to the set. So the way I look at it, it's not even abstract. I mean, it's the imperative coming from above. This is the choreographer. This is Sarah Mitchelson's face. And the dancer is literally dancing in the glow of her face above her. So there's that. Here's another example. This is another shot of the set. And this is the floor in the Whitney Gallery, and the architecture of the new Whitney was imprinted on the floor. So this is the set. I also happen to notice a certain looming figure in the background, but here's the caption, Lepecki's caption. The floor, imprinted with the architectural plan of the museum, blah, 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 blah. This is a picture of a floor for Lepecki. So it's not even what he's saying so much as what he's not saying that sticks out to me in this example. Yeah, it's like a little bit like, pay no attention to the neon face in the corner. Okay, so the other part of this that I want to draw our attention to is this piece of devotion not to the author of the plan, or the ruler, but to an impersonal devotion to the plan itself. So for me, he's suggesting an almost magical conversion of the choreographer's plan into this suddenly neutral or impersonal plan that the dancer is then obviously, kind of with the snap of a theoretical finger, enabled to enact at will. But I think that to deny that there's a power differential at work here between the choreographer and the dancer that might affect the dancer's ability to enact freedom is a huge oversight. So, and as any scholar worth their weight will tell you, considering a person's positionality within their social and cultural and political context decisively affects how free they are to act in that context. So here's another shot from this. It's a beautiful piece. It's very visually striking. But there's simply, as far as I can see it, no way to get around the fact that as long as there's a choreographic plan, there's a choreographer around somewhere. The authorship is kind of implicit in the term, which is okay. It's not bad to have a choreographer. They're necessary and wonderful people. But and dancers, and I'll talk about a little bit later, certainly can find a lot of freedom even within a choreographic plan. But it's not the same thing. The choreographer's relationship to a choreographic plan and a dancer's relationship to a choreographic plan just aren't the same. It also brings up the issue of authorship and ownership. So if this plan, as he's kind of implying, without really saying it, is truly co-owned between the dancer and the choreographer, then why do we still call it Sarah Mitchelson's work? Right? This is referred to as Sarah Mitchelson's work. So again, it seems like when it's convenient to have the dancer as part of the team, great, but when push comes to shove, the dancer is nudged neatly out of the picture. And the language that Lepecki and others use, to me, really speaks to that kind of erasure that happens. One of the dancers I interviewed who works on this topic of kind of ownership and authorship, one of the dancers I interviewed actually, who works in Europe, estimated that 80% of the movement he's seeing on stage right now is actually created by the dancers themselves. And in my survey, I asked dancers how often they were asked to contribute to the creation of the work by generating movement or improvising, what have you. Not a single dancer said never. Only one dancer said rarely. And the rest, 98% of the 57 dancers I talked to, fell into the sometimes, often, or always category, meaning that most dancers are being asked to be active participants in creating choreographic works that we see on stage. So then I asked how often these dancers are given credit as a collaborator. And I don't know if you can see these, but look at me with my fancy pointer. It's always, often, sometimes, rarely, and never. So kind of occupying the often, sometimes, rarely category. And then how often are you granted rights to work that you do? That's the never column there. So who is talking to dancers? I asked dancers how often they're asked to speak about their experience. And happily, they are talking. People are talking to dancers, so that was good to know. But then I asked who is talking to them when they're asked. And you'll notice friends and family. There we go. Many of whom are, for me, populating this. So thank you for being here. And other dancers probably make up most of the rest of you. Audience members also kind of interested in the dancer's experience. That's good to hear. This is the choreographer, and the crafts are around the same level. Donors, and way down here, there's 8 dancers reported, that researchers and writers, the people actually sort of documenting our field, are actually talking to the dancers. So let's talk about what the dancers did say when I asked them about freedom. One way of thinking about freedom, and I got so much data and it was really exciting, so trying to kind of organize it all for myself, I kind of came up with these categories, or ways of thinking about freedom. So freedom 2 refers to the ability for an individual to actively act on their wills and desires and to exercise authorship over their lives. So it's concerned with the capacity that a person has to kind of express themselves. And this was the kind of freedom that dancers often led with when I asked them about freedom, which is cool. So first and foremost, they mentioned the potential that their work as professionals has to support creative self-expression. And they talked about bringing their whole self, feeling free when they could bring their whole self to their work. They talked about movement practices as a means of finding their true self. And equally, they spoke of finding freedom in taking risks, in experimenting, in making choices based on their personal experience, intuition, and values, and feeling free to chase surprises and invitations that came along. I thought it was interesting also in this Freedom 2 category that several dancers talked about feeling free when they could follow their bodies. So freedom in following, which I thought was really cool, and responding to somatic impulses rather than responding to kind of predetermined, cognitively imposed directives. Others felt free that when they were able to engage in conceptual dialogue. And to me, all of these so far fit under what I would call a kind of interpretive freedom. So when dancers are feeling free to find and express meaning through their work. And that very much goes to what Alice and Lucy were talking about too. How we make meaning and find meaning in our work. So considering that from a freedom perspective, I think is really interesting. Also in the Freedom 2 category, we can put the wind in the hair. Yeah? So the actual physical feeling of having a body and moving through space. Dancers talked about being in the present, feeling free when they were able to really be in the present moment. And they talked about flow state, so a feeling of unity and flow state. Several dancers used that word. And there were many, many more. I could go on and fill this whole screen, but those are just some highlights. The limitation of Freedom 2 is that it seems to suggest, or it might seem to suggest, that freedom is as simple as just deciding you want to do one of these things and doing it. And clearly, and that approach kind of negates the very real external forces that can come into the picture and limit one's ability to exercise freedom. So we can move to freedom from. So some people are focused on what they need to be unshackled from in order for their sense of freedom to emerge. So the most common example of negative freedom that dancers talked about was hierarchical and authoritarian leadership models. Shocking, I know. Freedom from harsh criticism, from oppressive working conditions, not getting paid enough, being expected to dance while injured. Thankfully, I'm not here. Freedom from having to fit in, or from having to look a certain way. Several talked about physical downtroddenness, which I thought was really interesting. And a couple of dancers said that freedom shouldn't hurt. Yeah? Or that you can't feel free if you're hurting. Big one was freedom from the culture of silence that dancers are in, and the culture of obedience. And I just want to clarify that when I say culture of obedience, I'm not saying free from structure. And actually one of the really interesting findings about freedom for me was that dancers actually talked about needing structure to find freedom. Craving structure, needing rules, needing a container for that experience. And that freedom arose out of embodying that structure. So I thought that was pretty cool. But I think it's more the judgment and the control that can often go along with the imposition of a structure that started to feel oppressive. Dancers also talked about being free from manipulative directorship and from the psychological and emotional manipulation that can go along with that, including falsely compassionate directorship, misogynistic choreographers, and my personal favorite, babysitting narcissists. Was how one person described working for a particular choreographer. Dancers also talked about seeking liberation from their own self-judgment and the tyranny of perfectionism. They've talked about feeling free when they were freed from their own egos, and from caring what something looks like or how they're perceived and received, and from even knowing it's happening. And this one hurts my heart, but some people talk about being free from thinking. I love thinking and thinking about thinking. But several dancers did report, unfortunately, that they feel free when they don't have to think, and they can just do. They can just do a thing and not have to worry about it. So one more category that I made up, sort of, was freedom with. In response to the dancers that I heard talking about finding freedom in solidarity with others and in communities coming together and being animated by a common cause, they talked a lot about the relational element of freedom. That was interesting. So some examples, being free in collaborative creative process with trusted colleagues, being witnessed and needing a witness in order to feel free, which I thought was really interesting. A couple other people kind of said the opposite, that they actually needed to be alone to feel free, which is in a way a kind of freedom with, from my perspective. So freedom with self. And what else? Like having a common goal, working towards a common goal. One person described feeling free when they're part of a tribe. And a tribe of people that value the reasons that you do what you do. Also from having a community of mutual respect and safety were some of the conditions out of which freedom arose. So I want to make clear that despite these categories, this is what I call the Wheel of Freedom. That was Juliet's idea. Oh no, I think Lucy came up with it. Anyway, we've been playing around with this idea that I really like about the Wheel of Freedom, which is just a way of expressing that all of these versions of freedom I've been talking about are dynamic and changing. So you might find a freedom that has bits of all of these in it, and it's never one thing, and it's always changing. For example, a lot of people, surprisingly, when asked about their professional work, said they feel free when they're in nature. So, anyway, so, but you could talk about freedom as being, or is it being a freedom from sort of the pressures of daily life, yeah? But you could also talk about it as a freedom to go out into nature and to enjoy the natural beauty, or as a freedom with, as a kind of communing with. So all of these, one kind of freedom can kind of rotate on the wheel as it likes. But the one thing I'd love to point out is that nowhere in any of these kinds of freedom, in any of the responses I got from any of the dancers, did one dancer mention the word devotion. Or any version of devotion: commitment, loyalty, reverence, passion, dedication. I mean, maybe it's implicit. Why would we do what we do if those things weren't there? Maybe, but when dancers are asked to actually talk about what feels free to them, devotion was not at all part of it. So, FYI. Okay, so just a few takeaways. So that I got from doing this project. That freedom is highly individual. It means something different to everyone. That you can't tell what it looks like from the outside. You see that girl leaping across the pianos with her cell phone. It might look free, but you have to ask her to know if that really feels free or not. Yeah? I hope it does. I mean, look. That freedom is varied, it's layered, it's dynamic, it's on the wheel, and it moves. It's never static. It can't be possessed. Freedom is context dependent. It depends on who, where, and how matter. A dancer is not the same thing as a choreographer, just in case that was a thing. And that it's highly problematic to speak for dancers ever, but certainly in a conversation about dancers, and certainly in a conversation about freedom. So dancers are amazing people, talk to them, and that's it. Thank you. Well, that was part of my rub, is because I read this article, and this was someone I had worked for, and probably felt the least free I'd ever felt as a professional dancer, and so that was part of the rub that led me to do this. interesting, and I can tell you a little bit about my experience, but I'll do that first. So, and actually, Dad, I think you were in New York for this show. You might not remember, but I did a piece with her that was called Dover Beach, and it was a stage very much like this. And she didn't like the look of people entering midway through the performance. There wasn't any backstage, so you could only enter through there. She didn't like the look of someone entering once the performance had started. So my piece was just a 7-minute solo at the end of an hour-long show. I think I entered at minute 46 or something. But I couldn't enter then, so I had to be on stage. She built a little, it was like a 18-inch sort of foam board, like little mini fake wing on the side. And I had to stand behind it and stay warm for 45 minutes, waiting for my big entrance, which was then quite an entrance. It was like 2 big running steps, and I'd run and I'd grab my leg, and I'd hop backwards on one leg 20 times and do this whole thing. Also, the right side of the stage was a lattice. The set was like a lattice work cage. So when I did finally emerge from my hiding place, I left into a cage. And I did actually, it was a really hard solo. It felt kind of good to physically know that I could do that. It was very satisfying. It was good for my CV. I met some interesting people. I got a lot out of doing it, but definitely freedom was not top of that list. Also in that one, I had the face thing. It's like the thing she does. I think it was a pink face, not a green face. But I did talk to other dancers who had worked with her for this project, and kind of hoping that they would, be on board with me. And it was interesting because one of the dancers I talked to actually was like, yes, I felt totally free. I felt like it was, it was really clear what was expected of me. I didn't know if she had been a rock climber before she did this piece, and she felt like pushing herself to a physical limit and transcending what she thought she could do was very freeing. And so going into this show and not knowing how she was going to do this for 67 minutes and feeling like she was really at that brink of what she could handle, and transcending it for her was freeing. So that just kind of goes to support one of my takeaways, which is just that it's really different for everyone, and you have to ask the person how they feel free, if they feel free, when they feel free. Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, since many of us are educators and dance makers, and everyone in the room with us is experiencing freedom so differently, how do we go about setting up some kind of an experience for them where many people feel free at the same time?
Yeah.
Is that important? It seems that you think it is, that many...
It feels important to me. I mean, it's something I would like. I mean, I think that I have to accept that it's probably impossible to create that for everyone. But I did look through, as I was looking through this data for common, not just what field of freedom felt like, but what kind of the conditions were, what the environment was like, what the relationships were like. So there were some kind of consistencies, even with how varied people's experiences of freedom were. They all generally talked about a feeling of trust and safety and non-judgment. And so I think things like that are conditions that you can, try to allow for in a classroom or really in any relationship, really in any situation, to sort of maximize the potential for lots of different kinds of freedom being possible. Yeah?
I was just thinking about that too, and I'm wondering if maybe one of the ways, I don't know what you think about this after your research, maybe one of the ways that you can try to help with that in the classroom setting is to do what you're suggesting, is to ask. Ask the students, what are you experiencing, rather than assuming that we know. Does that sound like a legitimate possibility?
Oh, really?
The second thing that I wanted to say was that I've been very impressed with the last 25 minutes because I feel like you spoke about freedom, but you also somehow managed to make us feel really free in the room. I'm like on the verge of laughing right now because I've so enjoyed the way that you presented your information, and I've laughed about it many times. I think that was masterful.
Oh, that's unintentional. A natural at creating freedom.
And then finally, I was thinking that you and I have actually spoken about this in the past, but there are, I haven't heard of Sarah much as being one of these people, but there are certainly choreographers through history that people speak about both theoretically and also colloquially as being choreographers who have made an object of creating freedom, both in movement and in their social spaces. And so I would just be so satisfied if you continue this project or hand it off to somebody else in actually seeking out information from experiences of dancers who have worked with people like Forsyth and Cunningham and others, so that we can know, so that we can ask this question and have an answer that doesn't come from a theorist, a writer who's not spoken to the answer. I would love to have that.
Totally.
If you ever go there.
Yeah, you mean talking to people in
those companies.
In those companies?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, yeah. I talked to a dancer who works with Trisha Brown, and I don't know if you are all familiar with Trisha Brown's work, but it looks really free, and it was kind of this one example of how she was talking about like certain people in the company, when that kind of movement works for their body, it can feel really free, but it can also feel really frustrating and unfreeing to try to move in that way if it's not natural to your body. And so like even within one company there were all these really varied responses or experiences of freedom. But then I would wonder about how if the conditions of that company were set up to allow for multiplicitous experiences of freedom or not. Yeah.
I love it too. I mean, I've enjoyed this presentation tremendously. Yeah, a few things I noticed you didn't mention, but they seem to be kind of deeply background to all of this. One is the kind of tradition of domination. My ballet teacher, my first ballet teacher, had a stick, right? She was training me toward freedom. With a stick. She also didn't mention a lot about the domination of the gender disconnect that's happening in dance. I love that you went after Rebecca. I mean, I really did. For so many reasons. And because you mentioned Cunningham, I was just talking to Pat Rainey, who was asking Wayne Perrin about this gender difference, and she had come across a piece of paper in which Merce was talking to John, or John written Mercer, Mercer written John, I'm confused, so you might go after Pat Rainey to find out if this at all interests you. But they wanted to get rid of the matriarchy in dance, and it was down in written. What a curious thing. Yeah.
Just yes.
Yeah.
I think in the interest of freedom, we should end the formal part of this presentation so that people are free from the constraints of this structure. And you should feel free to engage in informal dialogue.
Free to.
Free to.
Well, free from the constraints.
Right, and free to is what I meant to say.
It's both.
Free to engage in informal dialogue at this moment. So thank you all so much for coming.